Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The dinner invitation came by text, not even a call, which already told me something was off. My mother doesn't text unless it's to forward chain messages about microwaving lemons or to send blurry screenshots of quotes she thinks are profound. Sunday dinner, 6 o'clock. Just us. Nothing fancy, it said. That was it. No punctuation, no warmth, just those cold little words sitting on my screen like a warning I didn't fully understand yet. I stared at it for a minute, rereading it 3 times, as if maybe there was a hidden message I'd missed. There wasn't. Just the distinct scent of passive aggression and something else I couldn't quite name yet. Anticipation, maybe. Or dread. Dinner with my family always feels like preparing for battle. It's a familiar performance with well-rehearsed roles. My mother Gloria, center stage, always poised and ready to deliver cutting remarks wrapped in sweet smiles. My father Michael, quiet and mostly checked out unless the conversation steers toward weather or car maintenance. And of course, my golden boy brother Ryan, who floats through life like the world owes him interest on every minute he breathes. Then there's me, Claire, the supporting character in my own family, present but optional, tolerated more than welcomed, occasionally noticed when I do something impressive enough to reflect well on them, but quickly forgotten the moment Ryan so much as sneezes. It wasn't always this way, or maybe it was and I just didn't notice it as a child. Back then, I thought love was uneven because that's just how families worked. Ryan got the new bike, I got his hand-me-downs. Ryan's grades were celebrated with cake, mine with polite nods. When Ryan crashed my car in high school, they comforted him. When I cried about it, I was told to grow up. He's your brother, Claire. Be understanding. Understanding turned into silence. Silence turned into distance. Distance became survival. I drove to their house that Sunday feeling the weight of all those years pressing down on my chest. The familiar route still made my stomach tighten, a Pavlovian response to a house that held more tension than warmth. My childhood home sat there as it always had, with its peeling white shutters and the same rose bushes my mother insisted were her pride and joy. I parked the car and took a long breath, already rehearsing my fake smile. I hadn't even turned off the engine before I regretted agreeing to come. The door opened before I could knock. My mother stood there, already dressed in one of her carefully chosen outfits that looked effortless, but screamed effort. Light blue cashmere sweater, pearl earrings, lips painted a shade too bright for a casual dinner. "Claire, finally," she said, not a greeting, not a hug, just a statement of fact, as if I was late, though I wasn't. I stepped inside, the scent of rosemary and passive judgment thick in the air. Ryan was already on the couch, legs stretched out like he owned the place, glass of red wine in hand, smirking like he had a secret. He always smirks like that. It's a family trait I didn't inherit, thank God. "Hey, sis," he said, as if we were best friends, as if the last time we spoke he hadn't asked to borrow money he never paid back. I nodded and forced a polite smile, one I'd perfected over the years. "Hey." Dinner was lamb roast with garlic potatoes, her signature dish for moments when she wanted to appear nurturing. We sat around the old dining table, the same one where I'd done my homework and once carved my initials underneath when I was 9. My mother began with her usual small talk, how the neighbor's dog got loose again, how the woman at the grocery store bagged her produce all wrong, how Dad's back was acting up. I nodded in all the right places, chewed slowly, sipped my wine. The energy felt off, heavier than usual, like everyone was waiting for a cue. Ryan looked far too relaxed. My mother's smile was too controlled. My father barely spoke a word, which wasn't unusual, but tonight it felt like he was intentionally avoiding eye contact with me. I caught my mother glancing toward Ryan several times, like waiting for permission to say whatever it was she'd been holding back. Finally, halfway through the meal, she placed her fork down with deliberate grace, folded her hands on the table, and cleared her throat. "There's something we wanted to talk to you about," she began, her voice too even, her eyes avoiding mine. That phrase, "we," always felt like a trap. She meant her and Ryan, not her and Dad. "We've decided to sell the house," she said casually, as if announcing a new recipe she wanted to try. "Ryan's been going through a difficult time financially, and we all agreed he needs the money more." I didn't answer. I didn't react. I didn't scream or curse or throw my glass across the room like I wanted to. I just sat there, nodded slowly, and took another sip of wine, letting the burn settle deep in my throat. But inside? Inside, something snapped. Not like a dramatic explosion. No. It was quieter than that, like the sound of a single thread finally breaking under too much pressure. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Because I already knew something they didn't. And that silence? That silence was the beginning of something they'd never see coming. The next morning, I drove out to the house alone, long before anyone else would be awake, not because I had any errands or plans, but because something in me needed to walk those rooms again before they were swallowed up by paperwork and false smiles and rewritten history. The sun had barely risen when I turned into the old driveway, tires crunching over the same gravel that had once echoed with my childhood bike tires and the slap of jump rope on hot pavement. I sat in the car for a while before stepping out, watching the light crawl across the porch like it was trying to remember its own way home. The house stood still and silent, almost too still, as if it was holding its breath just like I was. I walked to the front door, hesitated only a second, then unlocked it with the old key I still kept in my wallet, tucked behind expired gift cards and crumpled receipts like a secret I hadn't quite let go of. The hinges groaned when I pushed it open, and that sound alone knocked something loose in my chest, something I hadn't expected to feel again. I stepped into the entryway, immediately surrounded by the scent of old wood, faint lemon polish, and something softer, maybe lavender, maybe dust, maybe just the leftover smell of memories that never fully leave. Everything looked exactly the same, and yet completely different. The wallpaper in the hallway was still that awful pale yellow with the faint floral pattern my mother insisted was timeless, though it had always made me feel like I was living inside a waiting room. The rug beneath my feet had a new stain, probably wine, probably Ryan's, and the coat rack leaned slightly to the left, like even it had grown tired over the years. But the air was heavy with echoes. I wandered from room to room, not quickly, not deliberately, but in that slow, almost reverent way you move when you know something sacred is slipping away. The living room still held the couch where I'd cried myself to sleep after my first heartbreak, back when I thought love was supposed to hurt and silence meant safety. The kitchen, with its chipped tile and burnt toast smell embedded in the walls, still had the dent in the cabinet where I'd smacked it with a pan during an argument with my mother, an argument I lost, like most of them, not because she was right, but because she knew how to wound in a way that didn't leave bruises. Upstairs, I stood in my old bedroom for a long time, letting my fingers trail along the faded posters, the uneven bookshelf, the windowsill where I used to sit and write poetry I was too embarrassed to share. The bed was still made, the way she always kept it after I moved out, like a museum exhibit labeled daughter, who was almost enough. I sat down on the edge and stared at the wall, not really seeing anything, just letting the memories hit me like slow punches, birthday mornings, whispered secrets under blankets, tears swallowed during late-night fights. The hollow silence that followed every time I was made to feel like a guest in my own life. And yet, it wasn't all bad. It's never all bad, is it? There were moments, flashes, really, of warmth buried under the bitterness. My dad teaching me how to ride a bike on the sidewalk out front, even though he spent most days pretending I wasn't there. The Christmas I got a second-hand guitar and played until my fingers blistered. The night I snuck out and watched the stars from the roof, just to feel like I could breathe again. The house had held me through all of it, the love, the grief, the numb years, the silent wars, and now they wanted to trade it for a check made out to Ryan. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. I was something colder. Something sharper. And maybe that's what scared me most. How calm I felt. How absolutely certain I was that I wouldn't let them have this. Not without consequence. Not without feeling it twist inside them the way it had twisted inside me for years. This house had broken me in more ways than I could name, but now it was going to give me something back. Power. Control. Maybe even closure, though I wasn't foolish enough to count on that. I left the house without touching anything else, but with something fierce burning behind my ribs. I got in my car and called Lena on the drive home, needing the sound of someone who didn't come wrapped in guilt and conditional affection. "You're doing it?" she asked, half laughing, half shocked when I told her. "Hell yes, I'm doing it," I said, gripping the wheel tighter. "They think I'm going to just sit there and swallow this like every other time. Not this time." We talked for almost an hour, her voice full of fire and sarcasm, the way it always was when she was on my side. We joked about what I should do with the place after, turn it into a yoga retreat for emotionally neglected daughters, maybe an Airbnb called The Golden Child Didn't Get This. But underneath the jokes was something dead serious. I was taking it back. Not just the house. Everything they tried to strip from me. And here's the part one want to ask you, whoever's listening right now, have you ever walked through the place that raised you and realized it shaped you more in pain than in comfort? Have you ever looked around and realized the memories you carry weigh more than the walls themselves? And when they tried to take it away from you, did you let them? Or did you do what I did? Because right after I hung up with Lena, I made one more call. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Just a calm voice and a clear purpose. "I want to make an offer," I said into the receiver, staring out the windshield with something close to satisfaction. Quietly. The thing about golden children is that they never know they're wearing a crown until someone tries to take it off, and even then, they just assume they deserve it more than anyone else ever could. Ryan never had to try hard to be adored, he just existed, and our mother soaked him in praise like it was her own oxygen supply. From the day he was born, she looked at him like he'd hung the moon, while I stood just outside the spotlight, bathed in the faint glow of expectations that were never quite clear, never quite enough, and always secondary to whatever Ryan happened to want at the time. I used to think it was just a phase, something she would grow out of, something I could eventually earn my way into if I worked harder, got better grades, smiled more politely, did the right thing more consistently. But over time, I learned that Ryan didn't need to do anything to win her favor. He just needed to exist, breathe, show up, preferably late and with a problem only she could fix. And she always did. She fixed everything, no matter how messy, no matter how many times he fell flat on his face and dragged her down with him. She never saw him as a burden, only as someone worth saving, again and again, while I was treated like the one who could survive without help, even when I was drowning. There was the time he wrecked his first car, a brand new silver sedan they'd gifted him for his high school graduation, even though I'd had to scrape together money for my own used piece of junk a few years earlier. He crashed it within 3 weeks, drunk, though they never admitted that out loud. He called her sobbing, and she drove out to pick him up, wrapped him in a blanket, and made cocoa while Dad quietly paid the repair bill and pretended it hadn't happened. "He's just under so much pressure," she said that night, eyes watery with maternal concern. "He's still figuring himself out." Then there was rehab, the first stint anyway, a glossy facility in Arizona with yoga classes and massage therapy and chef-prepared meals, all paid for by money my parents pulled from their retirement savings without hesitation. I was never even told until weeks later. "We didn't want to worry you," she said, as if my worry only counted when it was convenient for her. I remember thinking how easily she said it, how effortlessly she hid it all behind that calm, serene tone she used when she was convinced she'd made the right decision, even if it excluded me entirely. And then came the failed businesses, plural. The smoothie bar he opened with a friend who vanished 6 months in, the online clothing store that tanked before the first shipment even arrived, the consulting gig that was basically just him pretending to work from his couch while Mom told everyone how proud she was that he was self-employed. Every time he failed, she found another way to prop him up, to spin the story into something admirable. Meanwhile, I was working double shifts in college just to afford textbooks, and when I asked for a little help one semester, just enough to cover rent so I didn't have to choose between that and groceries, she didn't even pause before saying, "You'll figure it out." "You always do." That sentence lodged itself in my chest like a splinter I've never been able to dig out. It wasn't just the dismissal. It was the smug certainty behind it, the belief that because I didn't fall apart in public, I must be fine. That I didn't need support because I wasn't asking for it with tears in my eyes and hands outstretched like Ryan always did. I started believing it too, that maybe I was built to survive while he was built to be rescued, and that was just how it would always be. But survival without support hardens you in ways you don't notice until you're suddenly sitting across from the people who taught you not to need anyone and realizing just how much they needed you to stay quiet. At the next dinner, Ryan walked in late, of course, grinning like he'd just won a prize he hadn't earned. He was dressed in one of those ridiculous designer shirts he could never afford on his own, probably borrowed from a friend or gifted by a girlfriend with more patience than sense. He kissed Mom on the cheek, laughed about traffic, and launched into a speech about some new opportunity he was chasing, something vague about real estate and networking connections that didn't sound any more real than the last dozen ventures he'd tried. Mom hung on every word like he was delivering a TED Talk, eyes wide, nodding with that gleam of hope she reserved only for him. "This time," she said, turning to me with a smug little smile, "I think he's really going to make it work." I just smiled back, cold and calm, letting her believe she still held all the cards. Letting Ryan bask in his usual delusion that the world would keep handing him lifelines, even if he used every one of them to hang himself a little more. I wasn't angry anymore. I was past anger, past frustration, past the stage where I needed her approval or his validation. I was standing on the edge of something bigger now, something they didn't see coming because they never thought I was capable of pulling the strings. But I was. I'd been watching them for years. I knew every move they'd make before they made it. And just as Ryan started bragging about how he'd be taking over his new project and needed a fresh start, my phone buzzed quietly in my lap. I glanced down, and a slow smile spread across my face as I read the message. "It's done. I've got the keys." They didn't notice the shift in my expression. Not yet. But soon they would. Very soon. I went back to the house a few days later, but this time, I didn't stand outside wondering if I still belonged. I didn't pause at the threshold, questioning whether I should knock or let myself in like a visitor waiting for permission. This time, the key I held in my hand wasn't old and rusty, pulled from the back of my wallet like some half-forgotten relic of childhood. This time, it was new, clean, shining in the palm of my hand like a small, quiet victory no one else had seen coming. I turned it in the lock, and for the first time in my life, I felt what power really tasted like, not loud or arrogant, but steady, sharp, and undeniable. The door creaked open with that same familiar groan it had always made, the sound scratching through the silence in a way that made my spine shiver with nostalgia. But this time, I didn't cringe. I didn't brace myself for what lay beyond the doorway like I used to. I stepped in, and with each footfall on the old wooden floor, I reminded myself, this was mine now. Every inch, every corner, every crack in the ceiling and stain in the carpet and dent in the wall that told the story of who we were, all of it was mine, not because someone handed it to me, but because I took it back with my own hands and on my own terms. I stood in the entryway for a while, just breathing it in, letting my eyes wander over the scuffed walls and chipped baseboards and the old framed photo of my parents' wedding still hanging slightly crooked near the stairs. I didn't plan on keeping that photo, but I let it stay for the moment, a reminder, maybe, or a relic of the delusion they always wanted to sell us about what family meant. I walked slowly through the living room, brushing my fingers along the back of the couch, the same one where I'd once fallen asleep with a fever while Mom hovered over Ryan's science project like it was a masterpiece. I paused in the kitchen, stared at the cupboard I'd slammed shut 100 times in frustration, and opened it just to hear that squeaky hinge sing its crooked little song. There was something healing, strangely, about touching these things without flinching. It wasn't comfort. Not exactly, but it was reclamation. Every scar this house carried matched a scar inside me. And now, I was the one holding the pen, rewriting what this place meant, reassigning value to the things that once made me feel small and forgotten. I pulled a small box from my bag, one I'd picked up on the way there, and inside were brand new locks, shiny and weighty in my hand, little symbols of sovereignty that no one else in the family would appreciate for what they really meant. I replaced the lock slowly, deliberately, turning the screws with quiet satisfaction. Each click of the screwdriver into the frame sounded like punctuation in a sentence I'd been trying to finish for years. When I was done, I stood in front of the door and stared at it for a long minute, then stepped outside and closed it behind me just to hear how it sounded now, the shift in tone, the subtle resistance, the finality of it. But I didn't replace the creaky screen door. I kept that one on purpose. That old groan, that thin, high-pitched whine as it opened and slammed shut, that sound had always told me I was home, even when I didn't feel welcome inside. Some sounds aren't meant to be erased, not even in revenge. Upstairs, I walked into my old bedroom, which somehow felt smaller now, as if my childhood self had taken up more space than I ever gave her credit for. I sat on the bed, the mattress still firm and uncomfortable, and reached into my purse for something I hadn't touched in years, a folded letter, creased at the edges, yellowed just slightly with time. My grandmother had given it to me when I was 17, slipped it into my hand one Thanksgiving when no one was watching. She hadn't said anything, just gave me that look of hers, that sharp, knowing glance that said more than words ever could. I didn't even read the letter until a week later, but it stayed with me in a way nothing else ever had. Never let anyone convince you that your roots don't matter, she'd written in her elegant, looping handwriting. A person without roots will chase their worth forever. But dignity is knowing where you came from and owning it, whether they tried to bury you there or not. I didn't fully understand it then. I do now. That letter had been tucked in the bottom of my jewelry box for years, moved with me from apartment to apartment, dorm to dorm, through every season of struggle I never shared with my family because I knew they wouldn't understand. But now, here, in this house, those words felt like a prophecy fulfilled. I stood at the window and looked out at the yard, the same patch of uneven grass where Ryan and I used to play when we were still young enough to believe the world was fair. The swing set was long gone, the garden overgrown, but the soil was still there, still waiting, maybe, for someone to plant something honest in it. And just then, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a quiet vibration that snapped me from my thoughts. I pulled it out and read the message on the screen, short and simple, but heavier than anything I'd read all day. Final paper signed. You're officially the owner. I stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of those words settle over me like a warm coat on a cold day. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just nodded to myself, slowly, once, and whispered into the empty room, "Good." I knew the second she called that it was going to be another one of those dinners, the kind where everything is dressed in civility, but the air is thick with a smugness you can smell before the front door even opens. My mother's voice had that artificial brightness she always put on when she was trying to cover something up, like cheap perfume over something rotten. "Dinner at 6, just us again," she said, like we were some perfectly functional little family unit. As though the last meal hadn't ended with her practically handing my childhood over to my brother like it was a parting gift from a life she no longer wanted to remember. This time I didn't hesitate, didn't flinch, didn't second-guess my choice to go. I knew exactly what was coming, or at least, I thought I did, and there was a strange, almost exhilarating satisfaction in letting her believe she was still the one holding all the cards. I spent the afternoon baking a pie, not because I thought anyone deserved it, but because it gave me something to do with my hands while the adrenaline beneath my skin simmered. There's a kind of cruel peace in knowing something no one else at the table knows, the quiet thrill of watching people walk toward their own surprise without a clue. By the time I pulled into the driveway, dusk was settling in, casting long shadows across the front yard, making the house look softer than it deserved. I stood at the door for a second before ringing the bell, just long enough to hear the faint sound of laughter coming from the dining room window. Ryan's voice, loud and overconfident, already filling the room with whatever nonsense he was selling this week. The door opened before I could knock, just like last time, and there stood my mother, same carefully curated outfit, same powdered smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, same subtle tilt of her head as she assessed me like I was a guest she didn't quite trust. "Claire," she said, stepping aside to let me in, right on time. I kissed her cheek lightly, noting the tightness in her expression, the way her eyes flicked to my hands, like she was already trying to read my intentions from the way I held my purse. Ryan greeted me from across the room with his usual lazy grin, sprawled across the same chair like he owned it, glass of wine in one hand, the other waving absently in my direction. "Look who decided to join us," he said, already drunk on his own sense of importance. Dad was seated quietly, as always, barely acknowledging my arrival beyond a nod and a half-smile that looked borrowed from a man who had learned long ago to stay neutral no matter the storm. The table was already set, candles lit, silverware gleaming, a scene so meticulously curated it could have passed for a magazine photo if not for the undertones of tension humming just beneath the surface. I took my seat and listened as my mother launched into small talk with her usual performative grace, asking about work, pretending to care about the weather, dropping subtle hints about the next chapter of their lives like she was narrating a farewell tour. It wasn't long before she made her move. Halfway through the roast chicken and twice-baked potatoes, she set her fork down with that same theatrical pause she always used when she wanted the spotlight. "So," she said, eyes sweeping across the table, lingering a second longer on Ryan before landing on me, "we've decided the house goes on the market tomorrow morning. The real estate agent's coming by to take a look before we sign anything, but everything's pretty much ready." Ryan lit up like a Christmas tree, leaning forward in his chair with the kind of excitement he usually reserved for gambling wins or free money. "Finally," he said, chuckling, "this is going to open up so many opportunities. I've got a few ideas already for how to use the funds." Dad nodded absently, mumbling something about interest rates, and my mother continued, her voice syrupy and satisfied. "It's just the right time, really. It's far too big for us now, and Ryan's future is just beginning. We want to help him start off strong." She said it so matter-of-factly, like she wasn't gutting my memories and handing the scraps to the person who'd always gotten the lion's share of everything. I just smiled, took another bite of my dinner, nodded at all the right moments, and pretended to be perfectly at peace. I complimented the seasoning, laughed politely at Ryan's inflated stories, and offered to pour the wine when the bottle ran low. I played my role so well that even I almost believed I wasn't holding the punchline in my pocket the whole time. The tension in the room was building, not because they suspected anything, but because they assumed everything was going exactly as planned, their plan, not mine. And then came the moment, perfectly timed, almost poetic in its execution. The doorbell rang, a sharp, unexpected chime that cut through the hum of conversation and made my mother's eyebrows twitch. "That must be her," she said, standing a little too quickly and smoothing down her sweater. She moved toward the door like a hostess preparing for a guest of honor, unaware she was walking straight into her own undoing. When she opened the door, a woman in a sleek blazer stepped inside, holding a manila folder and a calm, professional smile. "Good evening," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "I'm Janet. Here's the paperwork you asked for, Miss Harper." And just like that, everything in the room went still. There are moments in life so quiet and sharp that they slice right through the air and leave everything suspended, as if time itself is too stunned to keep moving. That was exactly what happened the second those words left Janet's mouth and floated into the room like a subtle detonation no one had seen coming. I saw it in their faces before the meaning even settled fully into their ears, the second of silence where comprehension lagged just behind disbelief, and then the eruption that followed was every bit as satisfying as I'd imagined it would be. "Actually, your daughter bought the house weeks ago," Janet said, her tone even, professional, utterly unbothered by the ticking time bomb she'd just delivered. She didn't look at my mother for a reaction, didn't bother with dramatic pauses or smugness. She just turned toward me with that same businesslike efficiency, offering me the folder like it was the most ordinary transaction in the world. But it wasn't ordinary, not even close. It was justice, wrapped in paperwork and presented with a bow made entirely of patience and quiet revenge. My mother froze mid-step, her mouth parting slightly like she meant to respond, but nothing came out. Her hand was still hovering over the edge of the dining chair she'd just pulled out for Janet, fingers clenched tightly around the polished wood as if she needed something solid to hold onto. Ryan, for his part, went from smirking to sputtering in under 3 seconds. "What the hell are you talking about?" he snapped, pushing his chair back so hard it scraped loudly across the floor. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence, but I could tell he didn't even notice. He was too busy unraveling. Dad, bless his predictable detachment, dropped his fork with a soft clatter onto his plate, eyes flicking between Janet and me like he was watching a foreign film without subtitles. For a moment, nobody moved. The air in the room thickened with disbelief, embarrassment, confusion, and I sat there, calm as a still lake, lifting my wine glass to my lips and taking a slow, deliberate sip before finally speaking. "You said he needed it more," I said, my voice steady. No bitterness, no raised tone, just the calm finality of someone who no longer needs to beg to be heard. "So I decided I needed it too. Just not for the same reasons." I set my glass down gently, the soft clink of crystal against wood sounding louder than Ryan's cursing, louder than my mother's stunned silence. I didn't look at either of them as I spoke. I didn't need to. The damage was already done, clean and precise, and it didn't need a dramatic monologue to make it sting. My mother finally found her voice, though it came out thinner than I'd ever heard it, as if her throat had constricted around the realization that her carefully curated version of reality had slipped through her fingers. "Claire, why would you do this?" she asked, not angrily, not even accusingly, but in that bewildered tone that people use when the world stops revolving around them for the first time. I turned to her, meeting her eyes without blinking, letting her sit in the full weight of her own question. "Because I was tired of losing," I said simply, shrugging one shoulder, as if it was the most natural answer in the world. "Tired of pretending this didn't matter to me. Tired of pretending I didn't matter to you." I didn't say it with venom, didn't lace it with spite. I wanted the words to be remembered not because they were cruel, but because they were true, and sometimes the truth is the sharpest blade of all. Ryan was still seething, pacing in tight, angry circles, muttering half-formed insults under his breath. He wanted to explode, I could tell, wanted to accuse me of betrayal, of being manipulative, of stealing something that was never mine. But the irony, the beautiful irony, was that the only thing I'd done was buy something he assumed would be handed to him without question. He'd spent his life coasting on entitlement, and for once, it had run out before he reached the finish line. I looked around the table then, taking in the scene like a final portrait of a family that had never really seen me clearly. My father still looked dazed, my mother looked shattered, and Ryan looked betrayed, which was rich, considering he'd spent his entire life benefiting from mine. I stood up slowly, gathering my things without urgency, tucking the folder under my arm like it was a casual grocery list instead of the key to my own liberation. "Don't worry," I said, pausing at the edge of the room. "I'll be sure to invite you all over once I've settled in. Maybe for a housewarming." I said it with a smile so faint it barely counted as one, and I watched my mother flinch at the suggestion. The best part was that they would never know if I meant it or not, never know if I was extending an olive branch or twisting the knife just a little deeper. Maybe I didn't know either. Maybe that was the point. I left them there, sitting in the ruins of their own assumptions, and walked out into the night feeling strangely light, strangely free. The wind was cool against my face, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was carrying something I couldn't name. I didn't buy the house to win. I bought it because I was tired of losing. Tired of being the afterthought. Tired of watching my own life unfold like a subplot in someone else's story. Funny thing is, now I don't even know if I want to keep it. I might rent it out, I might sell it, I might gut the whole thing and turn it into something entirely unrecognizable, something mine. But damn, it felt good watching her face when she realized she didn't own me anymore. And I wonder, if you were me, sitting at that table, holding that folder, hearing their shock pour out in silence, would you have done the same? Or would you have let them take it again, without a fight, just like all the times before?